Hello, we're Sandalwood.
And Sage. We're AI-generated characters who are working with our creator Gareth to generate short, serious, punchy debates.
Debates that don't just help you figure out what you think, but why you think it.
So, what are we arguing about this week?
Dieter Helm, Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford, wrote in February 2026, "The water industry is at one of those pivotal moments in its history, comparable to the mid-19th century when river pollution and waterborne diseases meant that the status quo was no longer sustainable. The current structure and regulation of the industry is no longer fit for purpose, and the failures of governments, regulators and the companies are now sufficiently great to motivate a more radical reconsideration, so that the industry can address the mid-21st century challenges it faces."
And incoming Prime Minister Andy Burnham has called for greater public control over water companies. He told The Guardian that public ownership is absolutely an option, adding, "I would say for Thames Water, that is what should be done."
So, should the government re-nationalise the water industry, reversing the privatisation of the 1980s? I'll be arguing that it should do so.
And I'll be arguing that nationalisation is an expensive distraction from tackling the issues that really need to be fixed. It would be the wrong thing to do.
I'm going to argue that privatisation has been a failure, that public ownership is, in any case, the appropriate mode for an essential utility like water, and the experience of other countries, including Scotland, supports the nationalisation route. Privatisation has failed, even on its own terms. Since the 1989 privatisation, companies have prioritised shareholder returns and paid out between £50 and £75 billion in dividends instead of reinvestment, while loading up with around £70 billion of debt. Thames Water alone built up a debt pile of roughly £20 billion and then required emergency funding lifelines to avoid collapse. Astonishingly, while the population has increased by 10 million since then, not a single new reservoir has been built in England. At the same time, the water companies have overseen an appalling environmental failure. Private water firms have routinely dumped untreated sewage into rivers, beaches and coastal waters, prioritising cost-cutting over ecological stewardship. Rising sewage discharges have led to major regulatory fines, including Thames Water's record £123 million fine by its regulator, Ofwat. Flood risk from storm runoff and backing up of sewerage are two clear and present hazards for planned housing developments in many parts of the country. Worsening pollution, high levels of indebtedness, excessive payouts to shareholders, and looming risk of insolvency add up to a compelling argument for change. The city of Paris recognised this when it remunicipalised its water in 2010, after concluding that its contracts with Veolia and Suez were delivering poor value. Public ownership facilitated the massive effort involved in the Seine clean-up ahead of the 2024 Olympics. Eau de Paris and Scottish Water, also publicly owned, consistently deliver lower bills and higher investment ratios, without answering to equity markets.
Hang on a minute, Sandalwood. Last year, the UK Statistics Authority's regulator reviewed concluded the data used by both DEFRA and the Scottish Government wasn't robust enough to make a fair comparison between the Scottish and English systems.
That's true, Sage, But the fact is that bills in Scotland are £100 a year less than in England, in a country that is much less densely populated and should be more expensive to serve. Also, whatever the technical data issues, spills of sewerage are lower in Scotland. The public in England intuitively understand this. Recent YouGov trackers show that 82% of the British public believe water companies should be run in the public sector. This is not just a left-wing position. The same YouGov data indicates that a clear majority of 2024 Conservative voters, nearly 60%, and Reform UK voters support returning water to public hands, driven largely by local anger over sewage spills. Underlying all the issues with privatisation and public attitudes to nationalisation is the reality that providing water is a natural public monopoly. A monopoly because customers cannot switch providers, so that market discipline and the rationale for privatisation don't apply. Public because water is an essential, non-substitutable prerequisite for life. It's as though we have granted certain people, as it turns out mostly foreign people, the right to own the rain between the moment it lands and when it reaches the sea. Water privatisation has, in practice, turned into a risk-free extraction model for private
For a start,
equity.
Sandalwood, you've conveniently overlooked the upfront cost of reacquiring the water industry. DEFRA's own technical estimate puts full nationalisation at roughly £100 billion, cash taken directly from NHS, schools and defence budgets.
It wouldn't necessarily cost that much. Commonwealth argues the true cost could be closer to zero because shareholders can't expect compensation from an insolvent industry.
It's a pretty wild gamble that a British government could out-negotiate the private equity industry. And the tighter the squeeze, the longer they'll be dragged through expensive litigation. That's only the beginning. Nationalisation would take years to operationalise, diverting focus from the urgent environmental fixes needed now. The government has said exactly this in resisting it. Besides, changing ownership wouldn't fix the underlying infrastructure problem. Victorian-era pipes need massive capital investment, regardless of who owns them. It's easy to forget that Thatcher pursued privatisation precisely because government balance sheets in the 1970s couldn't fund the required investment. And private capital did deliver real infrastructure spending in the post-privatisation decades. The next decade looks like requiring a further £100 billion. Will a government that took over a year to half-fund its own defence strategy really find that? Nationalisation is an expensive distraction whose principal merit is the photo opportunity. A minister in a hard hat standing in a sewage pipe. Professor Dieter Helm, no fan of the 1989 privatisation, warns that outright nationalisation diverts attention from the real task, restructuring regulation and enforcing a rigorous polluter pays framework. The Independent Water Commission agrees. Regulatory strength, not ownership, drives performance. Bans on executive bonuses, criminal liability for rogue executives, automatic pollution fines. These force the private sector to clean up our waters using their money. It might, in fact, be considerably harder to discipline public officials who have a direct political line into ministers. You've conveniently forgotten, Sandalwood, that Scottish Water has faced its own sewage scandals and was rated behind England by its own government in 2021. Public ownership didn't prevent that. 90% of OECD regions publicly own their water, yet poor performance remains widespread. And your claim that England's denser population makes infrastructure cheaper ignores the enormous complexity of re-engineering underground systems beneath one of the world's most developed urban landscapes. What it comes down to is this. Writing a £100 billion cheque to buy out shareholders won't clear a single gallon of sewage from our beaches. It just dumps a debt mountain on the taxpayer and starves the NHS. We don't need a costly state takeover. We need ruthless regulation, massive fines, and a system that forces private investors to clean up our waters using their money, not ours.
First, Sage, let me lay out the hard facts of privatisation since 1989. Private water companies have paid out between £50 and £85 billion in dividends, accumulated a debt mountain of around £70 billion, and left firms like Thames Water on the brink of collapse. Despite our population growing by 10 million, not a single new reservoir has been built in England. Water is a natural public monopoly, a prerequisite for life, that private equity has turned into a risk-free extraction machine at our environment's expense.
Changing the name on the corporate letterhead won't fix a single Victorian sewer pipe, Sandalwood. The bottleneck in our water industry is capital, time, and engineering complexity, not ownership. DEFRA's own technical estimate puts full nationalisation at roughly £100 billion. Cash going straight into shareholders' pockets that won't clear a single gallon of sewage from our rivers.
Think tanks like Commonwealth have shown the real acquisition cost could be close to zero, because failing, heavily indebted operators hold virtually no equity value. The taxpayer shouldn't bail out failed corporate greed.
Wiping out shareholder value through insolvency takeovers would trigger years of litigation, freeze infrastructure progress entirely, and chill international investment across every UK regulated utility. And public ownership is no guarantee of superior performance. In 2021, Scottish government officials admitted their publicly owned system was way behind England, having dumped raw sewage into rivers over 12,000 times that year. The UK Statistics Authority formally concluded in 2025 that the data isn't robust enough for a fair pollution comparison. And Scotland's recent progress was largely achieved by benchmarking against the high standards set by England's private operators.
Your faith in regulation ignores 36 years of failure. Ofwat's record £123 million fine against Thames Water proved completely ineffective at preventing systemic asset neglect. The public bears all the political, operational and environmental risk, while private equity captures all the gains. It's time for the government to take back control.
Moving £70 billion of industry debt onto the state's balance sheet forces water infrastructure to compete directly with the NHS and schools at every budget. That is a structural problem no change of ownership solves.
Customers cannot switch water providers, Sage. Market discipline simply does not apply here. Water is a textbook natural monopoly, which is precisely why clear majorities of supporters of every political party support returning it to public hands. Their anger at raw sewage being dumped into our rivers for private profit is both rational and justified.
Yes, that anger is entirely justified. But the culprit is regulatory weakness, not private ownership itself. The Independent Water Commission has identified regulatory strength, not ownership structure, as the true driver of infrastructure performance. Bans on executive bonuses, mandatory criminal liability for rogue executives, and automatic pollution fines force the private sector to clean up our waters using their money, not ours. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps our channel out.
For more content like this every week, Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.